At its peak, Western Electric employed more than 165,000 Americans and manufactured every single piece of equipment inside the Bell telephone system. Every handset, every switchboard, every mile of copper cable that connected this country to itself. Not some of it, all of it. For over a century, if a phone rang anywhere in the United States, Western Electric built the machine that made it happen. And then on a single January morning in 1984, a federal court order erased the reason the company existed. No product failure, no scandal, no competitor who outbuilt them. Just a signature on a consent decree. In 115 years of American industrial history began its quiet collapse. Most Americans never knew the name Western Electric. They knew the phone on the kitchen wall. They knew the satisfying weight of the handset. They knew the sound of the rotary dials spinning back into place. But the company that made all of it? Invisible. By design. For a century. How does a company that built the communications backbone of an entire nation disappear without a single American stopping to mourn it? That is the story of Western Electric. And it is also the story of what this country loses when the machines that hold it together are finally, quietly switched off. In 1869, the most important wire in America was not a telephone wire. The telephone did not exist yet. The most important wire in America was the telegraph wire. And every ambitious young man who understood electricity understood that the future ran along copper. Enos Barton was 24 years old and working as a clerk for Western Union in Cleveland, Ohio, when he decided he wanted to build things rather than transmit them. He was not an inventor. He was something rarer and, in the long run, more consequential. A man who understood how to turn an inventor's idea into a product that actually worked at scale. In 1869, he partnered with Elisha Gray, an electrician and self-taught inventor from Barnesville, Ohio, and the two of them opened a small electrical workshop in Cleveland. They called it Gray and Barton. They built telegraph equipment. They were good at it. Elisha Gray was the more famous of the two, though not yet. That fame, the painful, complicated kind, was still a few years away. Gray had a gift for understanding electrical systems the way a musician understands sound, intuitively, physically, as if the current ran through him rather than around him. He had been filing patents since the late 1860s, and by the mid-1870s he had turned his attention to something that seemed, at the time, like a curiosity: the transmission of human voice over a wire. On February 14, 1876, Elisha Gray walked into the United States Patent Office in Washington to file a patent caveat for a device he called a vocal telephone. He was a few hours too late. Alexander Graham Bell had filed his telephone patent application earlier that same morning. The ruling went to Bell. Gray lost by a margin measured not in months or years, but in hours, and that loss would define the rest of his life and redirect the trajectory of the company he had helped to found. Western Union, which had backed Gray's telephone research and briefly held rights to his work, eventually settled with Bell and walked away from the telephone business entirely. The Bell Telephone Company, flush with its patent victory, needed something urgently: a manufacturer. It could not build its own equipment at the scale the country was going to demand. Bell was a patent company, a licensing company, a business built on ideas. It needed a partner that knew how to make things. In 1881, the American Bell Telephone Company acquired a controlling interest in Western Electric, which had by then relocated to Chicago and grown into one of the more capable electrical manufacturers in the country. Enos Barton remained at the helm. The arrangement that followed was unlike anything else in American industrial history. Western Electric would manufacture exclusively for Bell. Bell would buy exclusively from Western Electric. No bidding, no competition, no outside customers for the core business. It was a closed loop. And inside that loop, something extraordinary was about to be built. Barton understood what the deal meant. Western Electric was no longer in the business of competing. It was in the business of executing, taking the inventions that came out of Bell's research laboratories and turning them into physical objects that could be installed in millions of American homes, offices, and telephone exchanges. The mission was not to be brilliant. The mission was to be reliable, consistent, and capable of operating at a scale that no other manufacturer in the country had ever attempted. There was a particular clarity to that mission that suited Barton's temperament exactly. He was not chasing glory. He was building infrastructure. And in 1881, with telephone service just beginning to spread beyond the largest American cities, infrastructure was everything. The first telephones Western Electric produced under the Bell arrangement were simple utilitarian objects, wooden boxes with metal components, designed to be installed by a Bell technician and expected to last. They were not beautiful. They were not meant to be. They were meant to work the first time someone picked them up and the 10,000th time and every time in between. That commitment to durability, to building something that did not break, did not fail, did not require the customer to think about it, would become the defining character of everything Western Electric made for the next 100 years. By the turn of the century, the Bell system was expanding faster than almost anyone had predicted. Telephone exchanges were opening in cities across the country. Long-distance lines were being strung across states and mountain ranges. Every switch, every relay, every length of cable, every handset in every one of those exchanges came from Western Electric. The company had become, quietly and without any particular fanfare, one of the most important industrial operations in the United States. Enos Barton would lead Western Electric until 1908. He died in 1916, having spent nearly half a century turning other people's ideas into the physical fabric of American communication. His name does not appear in most histories of the telephone. It does not appear on the phones he made. It barely appears anywhere at all. That invisibility, that complete subordination of the maker to the system, was not a failure. It was the design, and for the next 70 years it would work perfectly. There is a particular weight to a Western Electric telephone that anyone who grew up in mid-century America will remember the moment they try to describe it. Not heavy in the way of something poorly made, heavy in the way of something built to last longer than the house it sat in. When you picked up the handset of a Model 500, the weight told you something before you even dialed. It told you this was real. This was serious. This was a machine that would not fail you. The Model 500 arrived in 1949, designed by Henry Dreyfuss, one of the most important industrial designers in American history. Dreyfuss had spent years studying the human hand, how it gripped, how it tired, what angles felt natural over a long conversation. The result was a telephone so well proportioned that it became invisible in the best possible way. Nobody looked at a Model 500 and thought about design. They just picked it up and it felt right. That effortlessness was the achievement. By the mid-1950s, the Model 500 was in tens of millions of American homes, and the decade that followed would be the fullest expression of everything Western Electric had been built to do. The post-war boom was filling suburbs with new houses, and new houses needed telephones, and telephones meant Western Electric. The company was running at a scale that was almost impossible to comprehend from the outside. Hundreds of thousands of units moving through its factories every week, shipped to Bell operating companies across the country. Installed by Bell technicians who arrived in white trucks and left behind a piece of equipment that families would use for the next 30 years without once thinking about who made it. In the kitchen of a house in suburban Columbus, Ohio in 1962, the telephone hung on the wall beside the refrigerator. It was black. The cord was long enough that a mother could talk while she moved between the stove and the counter, the handset tucked between her ear and her shoulder, the coiled cord stretching and contracting as she worked. Her children knew not to interrupt when she was on the phone. The phone meant something adult was happening, something that required full attention and a lowered voice. When it rang, the whole house knew. That ring was not a sound you forgot. It was not a tone generated by a circuit. It was two small bells struck by a mechanical clapper, a sound with physical presence, a sound that came from somewhere and meant something. In an era before notification culture, before the constant digital interruption that would come later, the telephone ring was an event. Something was about to happen. Someone needed to speak to someone else, and the distance between them was about to disappear. Western Electric built the machine that made the disappearance possible, and it built it in places like Hawthorne Works in Cicero, Illinois, a manufacturing complex so large that it had its own hospital, its own fire department, its own restaurants, its own baseball teams. At its peak, Hawthorne employed more than 45,000 workers. Some families had 3 generations working inside the same gates. A grandfather who had started on the line in the 1920s might have a son in middle management and a grandson just starting on the floor. All of them building the same essential object, all of them part of the same unbroken chain. The workers at Hawthorne did not think of themselves as telephone manufacturers. They thought of themselves as the people who kept America connected. That distinction mattered to them. When a disaster struck, a hurricane, a flood, a fire, the Bell system's ability to keep communications running was a national story, and the equipment at the center of that story came from their hands. There was a pride in that which did not require anyone outside the factory gates to know the company's name. The work was its own validation. In 1959, Western Electric introduced the Princess phone, smaller than the Model 500, available in colors, with a dial that lit up at night. It was marketed with a directness that now reads as a time capsule of its era. It's little, it's lovely, it lights. The Princess was designed for the bedroom, specifically for the teenage daughters of American households who were spending hours on the telephone in ways their parents found excessive and their grandparents found incomprehensible. It came in pink, it came in turquoise, it came in beige and white and a pale yellow that the catalog called ivory. It was, for a specific generation of American women, the first object they ever thought of as their own private means of communication. And it sold in numbers that surprised even Western Electric's own projections. 6 years later came the trim line, a phone so well designed that it still appears in design history textbooks. The trim line moved the dial into the handset itself, a small, elegant solution to the problem of cord management that also made the phone look like something from the near future. The base was minimal, barely larger than a paperback book. The whole assembly was clean in a way that made the older rotary wall phones look suddenly institutional. Henry Dreyfuss had refined his own masterpiece. By the late 1960s, Western Electric telephones were everywhere, and everywhere meant something more total than the word usually implies. In 1970, more than 90% of American households had at least one telephone, and every one of those telephones had been manufactured by Western Electric or built to Western Electric specifications. No other consumer product in American history had achieved that kind of saturation across every income level, every region, every demographic. The television came close, the automobile came close, but the telephone was in places where televisions and cars were not, in the bedrooms of rural farmhouses, in the back offices of small-town insurance agents, in the hallways of apartment buildings in cities where families shared a single line between 4 households. When the cameras needed a telephone for a scene, any film, any television production, they reached for a Western Electric. The Model 500 appeared in more American films and television programs than any other manufactured object in the post-war era. It sat on Cary Grant's desk. It rang in the Corleone household. It was the phone Dustin Hoffman picked up in The Graduate. It was the phone that rang in the middle of the night in 1,000 domestic dramas because it was simply the phone. The only phone anyone in mid-century America could picture when they closed their eyes and thought of a telephone. What was it about that object that made it feel, to the people who grew up with it, like something more than a machine, something closer to furniture or to a fixture of the house itself? The answer may be simpler than it seems. The Model 500 never broke. It never needed to be replaced. It did not become obsolete. It simply worked every time, for as long as anyone needed it to. And in a world that was already beginning to accelerate toward disposability, that permanence meant something. People trusted it, and through it, quietly, invisibly, they trusted the company that made it, even if they never knew its name. That trust was the foundation of everything Western Electric had built. It was also, though no one understood this yet, the thing that made the company most vulnerable to what was coming. The arrangement between Western Electric and the Bell system was, by any measure, one of the most unusual business relationships in American industrial history. Most manufacturers competed for customers. Western Electric had one customer, and that customer was the entire telephone network of the United States. There was no bidding process. There was no sales force. There was no marketing department chasing contracts. Bell needed equipment, and Western Electric built it. That was the whole of the commercial relationship, and for the first half of the 20th century, it worked with the efficiency that bordered on the elegant. The scale that arrangement produced was staggering. By the 1920s, Western Electric was operating major manufacturing facilities, not just at Hawthorne Works in Cicero, Illinois, but in Baltimore, Maryland, where cable and wire were produced in quantities that supplied the eastern seaboard, in Kearny, New Jersey, just across the river from Manhattan, where the company built one of the largest single manufacturing complexes in the world, in Indianapolis, Indiana, in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, in Oklahoma City. The company did not advertise these locations. It did not hold press events or publish annual reports designed for public consumption. It simply built things, in enormous quantities, in facilities that most Americans drove past without knowing what happened inside. Hawthorne Works remained the symbolic heart of the operation. The complex covered more than 100 acres. It had its own power plant, its own water system, its own internal railroad. At its peak employment in the late 1920s, more than 45,000 people worked inside those gates, a workforce larger than the entire population of many American cities. The Hawthorne Works cafeterias served tens of thousands of meals a day. The company sponsored athletic leagues, a band, social clubs. Workers who started on the line at 18 sometimes retired at 65 without ever having worked anywhere else. Their children followed them in. Their grandchildren followed after that. This internal culture produced something that pure efficiency metrics could not capture. A workforce that understood, at a cellular level, what quality meant and why it mattered. A telephone that failed in the field was not just a product defect. It was a rupture in the Bell system itself. It meant a family somewhere could not make a call. It meant an exchange somewhere was down. The workers at Hawthorne took that seriously because the Bell system took it seriously, and because the Bell system was, in a way that is difficult to fully convey from this distance, a genuine source of national pride in mid-century America. Keeping it running was work that meant something. Then came the Second World War, and Western Electric's capacity was redirected in ways that revealed just how formidable the company's manufacturing infrastructure had become. The War Department understood early that Western Electric and Bell Labs together represented the most sophisticated combination of communications research and industrial manufacturing in the country. Beginning in 1940 and accelerating rapidly after Pearl Harbor, Western Electric took on military contracts that had nothing to do with telephones. The company manufactured radar systems for the Army and Navy. The SCR-584 gun-laying radar, which played a critical role in anti-aircraft defense, was a Western Electric product. It produced the M9 gun director, a sophisticated analog computing device that calculated the trajectory of enemy aircraft and fed targeting data directly to anti-aircraft batteries. It built proximity fuses, radio equipment, sonar systems, and components for the Manhattan Project's communications infrastructure. By the end of the war, Western Electric had produced military hardware valued at billions of dollars, more than almost any other American manufacturer. The company had done it without changing its fundamental character. It had taken complex technical specifications, engineered them into manufacturable products, and produced them in quantities that met military demand without sacrificing the quality standards it had built its reputation on. When the war ended and the factories retooled back to telephone equipment, the institutional knowledge those years had generated did not disappear. It deepened. The post-war decade brought the transistor. In 1947, Bell Labs scientists John Bardeen, Walter Brattain, and William Shockley invented the transistor at Bell's research facility in Murray Hill, New Jersey, one of the most consequential technological achievements of the 20th century. Western Electric's role in what followed is not often told, but it is essential. Bell Labs invented the transistor. Western Electric figured out how to make it. The manufacturing challenges were immense. Transistors required levels of material purity and assembly precision that were entirely new to industrial production. The semiconductor materials behaved in ways that standard metalworking and electrical assembly could not accommodate. Western Electric spent years developing the processes, the tooling, and the quality controls that would allow transistors to be produced reliably and at scale. When those processes were ready, AT&T made a decision that shaped the entire subsequent history of the electronics industry. In 1952, it licensed the transistor technology to any company that wanted it for a fee of $25,000. More than 40 companies paid that fee. The list reads like the founding charter of the modern electronics industry: Texas Instruments, Sony, Motorola, RCA, General Electric. The transistor license that Western Electric administered did not make Western Electric famous, but it seeded every corner of the technology world that would eventually rise up and, decades later, make Western Electric obsolete. By the early 1960s, Western Electric was at the height of its industrial power. Its factories were running at full capacity. Its workforce was growing. Its products were in every American home, and office, and public building. The Bell system it served was the largest private employer in the United States, and Western Electric was the engine that kept it stocked and operational. No disruption was visible on the horizon. No competitor had the scale to challenge it. No technology existed that threatened to make its products unnecessary. From inside the company, the future looked exactly like the present, extended forward indefinitely. That was the assumption. That was the comfort. And that comfort, so deeply earned and so apparently justified, was the first condition of the catastrophe that was quietly being prepared for them in Washington. By 1970, there were more than 120 million telephones in the United States. Every single one of them had been manufactured by Western Electric or built to Western Electric specifications. That number is worth sitting with for a moment. Not as a business statistic, but as a human fact. 120 million households, offices, schools, hospitals, fire stations, police precincts, corner drugstores, and roadside diners, all connected to each other through equipment that came from the same source. No other manufactured object in American history had achieved that kind of reach. Not the automobile, not the television, not anything. And yet almost no one knew the company's name. That invisibility was not accidental. It was the logical outcome of a business model that had never needed public recognition to survive. Western Electric did not sell to consumers. It sold to Bell, and Bell sold to America. The brand on the telephone was Bell. The brand in the advertisements was Bell. When a technician arrived to install a new phone, he wore a Bell uniform and drove a Bell truck. Western Electric was the hand inside the glove. Essential, invisible, and entirely content to remain that way. But the people who worked for Western Electric knew exactly what they had built, and in the decades between the end of World War II and the early 1970s, that knowledge carried a weight that was close to patriotic. The telephone network they maintained was not simply a commercial convenience. It was national infrastructure in the most fundamental sense, as critical to the functioning of American society as the interstate highway system or the electrical grid. When President Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas in November 1963, the Bell system carried more calls in the hours that followed than it had ever handled in a single day. The network held. When Neil Armstrong's voice came back from the lunar surface in July 1969, it traveled through Bell system equipment on its way to the world. When the hotline between Washington and Moscow was established in 1963 to reduce the risk of accidental nuclear war, it ran through Western Electric hardware. The stakes of what these workers built every day were not abstract. They were existential. Inside the factories, the sense of mission expressed itself in ways that outsiders might have found difficult to understand. Quality control at Western Electric was not a department. It was a religion. A telephone that left the factory with a defect was a personal failure, not of a process, but of the individual worker who had passed it through. Inspectors were respected figures on the factory floor, not adversaries. When a batch failed inspection, the response was not to hide it or negotiate around it. The response was to find out why, fix it, and make sure it never happened again. That standard had been set by Enos Barton in the 19th century and had never been seriously relaxed. The workers who carried that standard through the middle decades of the 20th century were, in many cases, the children and grandchildren of the workers who had established it. Families at Hawthorne Works in Cicero, Illinois, measured their tenure in generations. A man who had started on the line in 1928 and retired in 1965 might have watched his son start in 1955 and his grandson in 1978. The institutional memory that accumulated across those overlapping careers was one of the most valuable things Western Electric possessed. And like most things that accumulate gradually and organically, it was almost impossible to replace once it was gone. The community that grew up around Hawthorne was inseparable from the factory itself. Cicero was a working-class suburb of Chicago, and Western Electric was its economic center of gravity. The stores on the main streets served the factory workers. The churches held services calibrated to shift schedules. The schools knew that a significant portion of their graduates would one day pass through the Hawthorne gates. When the factory held its annual employee picnic, a tradition that stretched back to the early 20th century, it was one of the largest single gatherings in the Chicago metropolitan area. Tens of thousands of people, three generations of the same families, spread across the factory grounds in a celebration that was as much about community as it was about employment. Western Electric's cultural reach extended far beyond Illinois. In Baltimore, in Kearney, in Indianapolis, in the dozen other cities where the company operated major facilities, the same pattern repeated itself. The factory was not just a place of employment, it was a civic institution, a source of stable wages, union benefits, pension security, and the particular kind of pride that comes from building something that the whole country uses without knowing who made it. How do you measure the cultural weight of a company that everyone depended on and almost no one recognized? The question is not rhetorical. It points to something genuine and strange about the way American industrial culture worked at its mid-century peak, the way the most essential things were often the least visible, and the way that invisibility was mistaken, for a very long time, for invulnerability. In 1975, Western Electric's revenues exceeded $5 billion. Its workforce was among the largest of any private employer in the country. Its products were performing flawlessly in hundreds of millions of installations across the United States. The company had never lost a major contract. It had never faced a serious competitor. It had never been required to explain itself to the public or justify its existence to anyone outside the Bell system. That was the world Western Electric knew. That was the only world it had ever needed to know. In Washington, a very different world was being prepared for it. The legal case that would eventually destroy Western Electric did not begin with a dramatic courtroom moment or a front-page scandal. It began with a filing. On November 20th, 1974, the United States Department of Justice filed an antitrust suit against AT&T, the parent company of both Bell Labs and Western Electric, alleging that the Bell system structure constituted an illegal monopoly in violation of the Sherman Antitrust Act. The complaint was dense, procedural, and written in the language of regulatory law. It did not make headlines the way a product recall might, or a factory fire, or a labor strike. It was a document filed in a federal courthouse, and most Americans never heard about it. Inside AT&T's headquarters at 195 Broadway in New York, the reaction was measured. The company had faced antitrust scrutiny before. A 1949 Justice Department case had ended in a consent decree in 1956 that restricted Western Electric's activities but left the core structure of the Bell system intact. The instinct at the executive level in 1974 was that this new case would resolve similarly. AT&T had resources, lawyers, and political relationships that few corporations in American history could match. The assumption was that the government would push, AT&T would negotiate, and the outcome would be a manageable adjustment rather than a fundamental restructuring. That assumption was not unreasonable given the history. What it failed to account for was that the political and regulatory environment of the mid-1970s was fundamentally different from the environment of the 1950s. The consumer protection movement had matured. Congressional skepticism of large corporations had deepened in the wake of Watergate and the general erosion of institutional trust that characterized the decade. And the specific judge who would eventually hear the AT&T case, Harold Green of the United States District Court for the District of Columbia, was not a judge inclined toward accommodation. While the legal machinery ground forward in Washington, a separate and in some ways more immediate pressure was building from a different direction. Throughout the 1970s, foreign manufacturers, particularly Japanese electronics companies, were producing telecommunications equipment of comparable quality to Western Electric's at significantly lower prices. Nippon Electric Company, Fujitsu, and others were beginning to attract the attention of telephone companies in other countries and, increasingly, of American businesses and regulators who wondered why Bell customers were required to use only Western Electric equipment when alternatives existed. Western Electric had never competed on price. It had never needed to. Its relationship with Bell was not a market relationship. It was a structural one, built into the legal and organizational architecture of the Bell system itself. The company's cost structures reflected that reality. Its wages were union wages, among the highest in American manufacturing. Its quality standards required expensive processes and extensive inspection. Its facilities were older in some cases. Hawthorne Works had been operating since 1905 and carried the maintenance costs of age. None of this had mattered when Bell was the guaranteed buyer of everything Western Electric produced. It began to matter enormously when the possibility of open competition first appeared on the horizon. Inside the factories, the people closest to the work were aware that something had shifted, though most could not have named exactly what. A foreman at the Hawthorne Works in the late 1970s, a man who had started on the line in 1958 and worked his way up through 2 decades of steady promotion, received an internal memorandum in 1977 outlining potential structural changes to the Bell system under various antitrust settlement scenarios. He read it carefully. He filed it. He did not discuss it with the workers on his floor, partly because the document was marked for management distribution only, and partly because he genuinely believed, as most people at his level believed, that the scenarios it described were theoretical. Planning documents, contingencies that serious organizations prepared and then set aside when the world continued as expected. He was not alone in that belief. The culture at Western Electric was not a culture of existential anxiety. It was a culture of execution, of getting the work done, meeting the specifications, shipping the product on time. Existential questions were for the executive floors, for the lawyers in New York, for the people who dealt in abstractions. On the factory floor, the work was concrete and the work was good, and as long as the work continued, the world made sense. But the work was already beginning to change in ways that were harder to ignore. The transition from electromechanical switching systems, the vast, clicking, relay-driven machines that had routed telephone calls since the early 20th century, to electronic switching was accelerating. Bell Labs had developed the first electronic switching system, the #1 ESS, in 1965, and Western Electric had manufactured it. But electronic switching required a different kind of manufacturing knowledge, a different set of materials, a different workforce profile than electromechanical switching had required. The men who understood crossbar switches and relay logic had spent careers acquiring that knowledge. It did not transfer automatically to semiconductor-based systems. Retraining was possible, but it was slow, and the pace of the technology was not slow. There was a particular moment, sometime in the late 1970s, that several longtime Western Electric engineers would later describe in similar terms without having compared notes. It was the moment they looked at the product roadmap, at the direction the technology was going, at the skills the next generation of products would require, at the distance between where the company was and where it needed to be, and felt for the first time something that was not quite fear, but was adjacent to it. A recognition that the certainty they had always taken for granted was not, in fact, a property of the world. It was a property of the arrangement, and the arrangement was under pressure from directions that no amount of manufacturing excellence could address. How long could a company that had never once been required to justify its own existence survive in a world that was suddenly asking the question? The answer was being written in a federal courthouse in Washington, and in the boardrooms of AT&T, where the people with the authority to fight were quietly calculating whether fighting was worth the cost. On January 8, 1982, AT&T and the United States Department of Justice announced that they had reached a settlement. The case that had been working its way through the federal court system since 1974 was over. AT&T would not fight. It would not appeal. It would not spend another decade in litigation defending the structure of the Bell system. Instead, it agreed to divest itself of its local telephone operating companies. The 22 Bell companies that provided local telephone service across the country, and to do so by January 1, 1984. 2 years. That was all the time that remained for the Bell system as it had existed for a century. The announcement was front-page news. The breakup of AT&T was framed in most coverage as a victory for consumers. The end of a monopoly, the beginning of competition, the opening of the American telecommunications market to the forces that would eventually produce lower prices and greater innovation. Those arguments were not wrong, but they were told from a particular vantage point, and from that vantage point, Western Electric was barely visible. What the coverage did not linger on, what almost no one paused to examine carefully, was what the divestiture meant for the manufacturing arm of the Bell system. AT&T was keeping Bell Labs. AT&T was keeping its long-distance network. AT&T was keeping its corporate identity and its place at the center of American communications. What AT&T was not keeping, in any meaningful sense, was Western Electric. Not as it had existed, not as a guaranteed manufacturer for a unified national telephone system, because that system was being dismantled. The customer that had sustained Western Electric for 100 years was not going away entirely, but it was being fragmented into pieces, and fragmented customers negotiate differently than unified ones. They shop around, they compare prices, they consider alternatives. Western Electric had no experience with any of that. The decision to settle rather than fight was made at the highest levels of AT&T's leadership, and it was made by all accounts with a clear-eyed understanding of the trade-offs involved. Chairman Charles Brown had concluded that continued litigation was consuming resources, generating uncertainty, and preventing AT&T from positioning itself for the deregulated future that was coming regardless of how the antitrust case resolved. The logic was defensible. From AT&T's perspective, the settlement preserved what mattered most: the long-distance network, the research capability of Bell Labs, the corporate infrastructure that could compete in an open market. What it did not preserve was the world that 165,000 Western Electric workers had built their lives inside. There is no evidence that the workers at Hawthorne or in Baltimore or in Kearney or in any of the other Western Electric facilities were consulted about the settlement. There is no evidence that their situation was weighted heavily in the calculations that produced it. The people who negotiated the consent decree were attorneys and executives whose professional futures were not located on a factory floor in Cicero, Illinois. They were sophisticated people making a sophisticated decision about corporate strategy and the collateral consequences of that decision. The human consequences were not their primary concern. In the months after the January 1982 announcement, Western Electric's management began the process of trying to reposition the company for a post-divestiture world. The challenge was almost paralyzing in its scope. Western Electric had never marketed itself. It had no consumer brand. It had no sales infrastructure for approaching customers outside the Bell system. It had no experience setting prices in a competitive environment because it had never operated in one. Its cost structures were built around the assumption of guaranteed volume, and guaranteed volume was precisely what was disappearing. The company attempted to rebrand. Plans were developed to position Western Electric as a competitive telecommunications equipment manufacturer, a company that could sell to the newly independent Bell operating companies, to businesses, potentially to international customers. These plans were earnest and, in retrospect, insufficient. The gap between what Western Electric was and what it needed to become was not a gap that could be closed in 2 years, or possibly in any amount of time. A company's character is not its product line. It is its institutional habits, its decision-making culture, its understanding of who it serves and why. Western Electric's institutional habits had been formed over a century of serving one customer in one arrangement. Changing them was not a rebranding exercise, it was a different kind of company entirely. At Hawthorne Works, the consequences arrived before the official divestiture date. Production lines began to wind down in 1982 and 1983, as orders from the Bell operating companies declined in anticipation of the new competitive environment. Workers who had spent decades on specific product lines found those lines discontinued. The factory that had employed 45,000 people at its peak was operating at a fraction of that capacity. The cafeterias that had served thousands of meals a day were quieter. The parking lots had gaps in them that had not been there before. The notifications came in envelopes. A worker who had been at Hawthorne since 1961, 22 years, 2 decades of perfect attendance, a man whose father had worked the same line before him, received his layoff notice on a Thursday morning in the fall of 1983. He cleaned out his locker that afternoon. He shook hands with the men he had worked beside for 2 decades. He walked out through the same gates he had walked through every working day of his adult life, and the gates did not close behind him dramatically or symbolically. They stayed open. Other people were still going in. The ending was not a moment. It was a process, slow and relentless and without ceremony. The cruelest aspect of what happened to Western Electric was not the scale of the destruction, though the scale was enormous. It was the silence around it. AT&T's divestiture was covered extensively. The creation of the 7 regional Bell operating companies, the Baby Bells, it was analyzed in detail. The future of long-distance competition was debated at length, and somewhere in the margins of all that coverage, quietly, almost without notice, one of the largest and most consequential manufacturing operations in American history was being taken apart. The workers who lost their jobs did not hold press conferences. The factories that closed did not generate the kind of coverage that plant closures in the automobile industry generated, perhaps because Western Electric had never cultivated the public profile that would have made its losses visible. The company had spent a century being invisible. It was invisible at the end, too. And who was supposed to protect the people who had given those working lives to a system that had just decided, in a settlement conference in Washington, that their expertise was no longer structurally necessary? The answer, as it turned out, was no one in particular. The pension obligations would be met. Western Electric's union contracts ensured that, but the community that the factory had sustained, the institutional knowledge that had accumulated across generations, the particular pride of a workforce that had built the communications infrastructure of a nation. None of that transferred to a balance sheet, and none of it was preserved. On January 4, 1984, the Bell system ceased to exist. Western Electric was folded into a newly reorganized AT&T as a subsidiary called AT&T Technologies, a name chosen to signal a forward-looking corporate identity and carrying in the process almost no trace of the company it replaced. The Model 500 telephone, the Princess phone, the trim line, the crossbar switches, the transistor licenses, the Hawthorne Works, the 3 generations of workers, the century of institutional knowledge. All of it now lived inside a corporate structure that was trying to forget what it had been in order to imagine what it might become. It would not succeed, but that part of the story still lay ahead. The Hawthorne Works in Cicero, Illinois, did not close on a single dramatic day. There was no final whistle, no last shift announcement, no moment when the gates swung shut and a crowd gathered to mark the occasion. The closure happened the way most institutional deaths happen, gradually, then completely, with the gradual part lasting long enough that people stopped expecting the completely part to arrive, and then it arrived anyway. Production at Hawthorne had been declining since the early 1980s as the divestiture approached, and orders from the Bell operating companies thinned. By 1983, the facility that had once employed 45,000 workers was running with a fraction of that workforce. Entire wings of the complex had gone quiet. Equipment that had run continuously for decades sat idle. The internal railroad that had moved materials between buildings, a piece of infrastructure so embedded in the factory's daily life that workers navigated by it the way city residents navigate by transit lines, carried less and less freight each month until it stopped carrying any. The formal closure of the primary Hawthorne manufacturing operations came in 1983 before the Bell system divestiture was even complete. The timing carried a particular bitterness. The company that had been told its problems would begin on January 1st, 1984, was already dying in 1983. The countdown that AT&T's leadership had presented as an adjustment period was, for Hawthorne, not an adjustment period at all. It was a terminal diagnosis with a date attached. For the workers who remained through the final months, the experience was one of incremental erasure. A department would be notified on a Friday that its last day would be the following Friday. The workers would spend that week finishing whatever was on the line, cleaning their stations, saying the kinds of things people say when they understand that a chapter is ending and do not have adequate language for it. Then they would leave, and the space they had occupied, the specific square footage of floor, the particular configuration of machinery, the coffee can someone had used as a pencil holder for 15 years would be absorbed into the general silence of a building that was becoming something other than what it had been. A woman who had worked in the cable assembly division at Hawthorne since 1969, 14 years through 2 contract negotiations and 1 factory fire that had closed her section for 3 weeks in 1975, received her layoff notice in the spring of 1983. She had known it was coming. Everyone had known it was coming. Knowing did not make it less real when the envelope arrived. She had started at Hawthorne at 23, had met her husband in the Hawthorne cafeteria, had raised 2 children on a Western Electric salary. The factory was not a backdrop to her life. It was a load-bearing wall. What made the human cost of Western Electric's collapse particularly difficult to account for was the same thing that had defined the company throughout its existence: its invisibility. When a steel mill closed, the story was told. When an automobile plant shuttered, the cameras arrived and the politicians made statements, and the displaced workers had a recognizable narrative frame for their loss. Western Electric workers did not have that frame. The company they worked for was not famous. Its closure was not a cultural event. The people who lost their jobs at Hawthorne, in Baltimore, in Kearney, in Indianapolis, they lost them inside a corporate reorganization story that the press was covering from a completely different angle, focused on competition and consumer benefit and the exciting new landscape of American telecommunications. The workers were in the footnotes. In the years immediately following the 1984 divestiture, AT&T Technologies, the renamed Western Electric, continued to shrink. The 7 newly independent regional Bell operating companies, now free to purchase equipment from any supplier, began doing exactly that. Ericsson, Northern Telecom, Fujitsu, NEC, companies that had been excluded from the Bell system market for decades by the Western Electric arrangement, moved in quickly. They offered competitive prices. They offered products designed for the digital switching environment that was replacing the electromechanical systems Western Electric had built its reputation on. They offered, in some cases, a more aggressive vision of where telecommunications technology was heading. AT&T Technologies could not match them on price. Its cost structures were too high, its transition to digital manufacturing too slow, its institutional identity too thoroughly formed around the assumption of guaranteed volume. The company that had been built to serve one customer perfectly and at any scale was not built to compete against a dozen nimble competitors for the business of customers who now had choices. The workforce numbers tell the story with a precision that individual accounts cannot. Western Electric had employed approximately 165,000 workers at its peak in the late 1970s. By 1985, that number had fallen below 100,000. By 1990, it was below 60,000. The reductions were not announced as a single event. They arrived in waves: restructuring initiatives, facility consolidations, product line discontinuations, each one described in corporate language that emphasized efficiency and strategic focus and never quite got around to describing the human scale of what was being dismantled. The Kearney Works in New Jersey, one of the largest Western Electric facilities outside of Hawthorne, was reduced and eventually closed. The Baltimore operations shrank. The Indianapolis facility contracted. In city after city where Western Electric had been a stable and central employer for decades, that stability evaporated within a few years of the divestiture. The communities that had organized themselves around these facilities, the neighborhoods, the local businesses, the school systems that had been sustained by factory wages, absorbed the losses without the national attention that might have generated a policy response or even a coherent public narrative. The brand itself disappeared in stages. AT&T Technologies became Lucent Technologies in 1996 when AT&T spun off its equipment manufacturing operations as a separate company. The Lucent spinoff was greeted with considerable enthusiasm. The stock market valued it highly. Analysts praised the logic of separating the manufacturing and research business from the long-distance and consumer telecommunications business. And for a few years in the late 1990s, Lucent looked like a success story. It carried Bell Labs with it. It carried the institutional lineage of Western Electric, though not the name. It carried for a brief moment the possibility that something of what had been built over a century might survive in a recognizable form. That possibility ended in 2001. The collapse of the technology bubble hit Lucent with particular severity. The company had expanded aggressively during the dot-com years, extending credit to telecommunications startups that subsequently failed, building inventory for a demand that evaporated almost overnight. Lucent's stock, which had traded above $80 per share in 1999, fell below 2 by 2002. The company that had inherited the manufacturing legacy of Western Electric lost more than 90% of its market value in less than 3 years. The final chapter of the Western Electric lineage came in 2006, when Lucent merged with the French telecommunications company Alcatel to form Alcatel-Lucent. The combined company struggled for a decade to find a sustainable identity before Nokia, the Finnish technology company, acquired it in 2016. The Bell Labs name survived inside Nokia, a piece of intellectual branding attached to a research operation that Nokia valued for its patent portfolio and engineering talent. The manufacturing legacy of Western Electric, the factories, the workers, the institutional knowledge, the century of accumulated craft, did not survive in any form that would have been recognizable to Enos Barton or to the men and women who had built telephone equipment in Cicero, Illinois, for 3 generations. The last Model 500 telephone was manufactured in 1986. By then, the rotary phone had been functionally obsolete for years. Touch-tone dialing had been available since 1963, and the Bell system's push toward digital infrastructure had made the old electromechanical handsets anachronistic. But the Model 500 had lasted in production for 37 years, which is longer than most products last in a single decade, and its discontinuation passed without ceremony. Somewhere in the storage rooms of American households, in basements in Ohio, in closets in Illinois, in the back rooms of antique stores in New Jersey, the phones still exist. Black, heavy, indestructible, picked up and set down and picked up again for 30 years without complaint. Built to last by people who believed their work would last just as long. What does it mean when the most reliable thing a company ever made outlives the company itself by decades, sitting in a box somewhere, still functional, waiting for a line that will never be connected again? When the Bell system broke apart on January 1st, 1984, the immediate beneficiaries were not difficult to identify. The 7 regional Bell operating companies, Pacific Telesis, Ameritech, Bell South, Nuinex, Bell Atlantic, Southwestern Bell, and US West, inherited the local telephone infrastructure that Western Electric had spent a century building and maintaining. They inherited the customers, the physical plant, the right-of-way agreements, the institutional relationships with local governments and regulators. What they did not inherit was an obligation to buy their equipment from Western Electric. That obligation had been the legal and commercial spine of Western Electric's existence. And when it was severed, the equipment market that Western Electric had monopolized for 100 years opened overnight to every competitor that had been waiting outside the door. They did not wait long to enter. Ericsson, the Swedish telecommunications equipment company, had been manufacturing switching systems and telephone hardware for decades, but had been effectively excluded from the American market by the Bell system's internal procurement arrangement. The divestiture changed that immediately. Ericsson moved aggressively into the American market in 1984 and the years that followed, offering digital switching equipment at prices that AT&T Technologies could not match, and with a product roadmap oriented toward the all-digital network that American telecommunications was clearly becoming. Northern Telecom, the Canadian manufacturer, had already established a foothold in the American market through independent telephone companies that had never been part of the Bell system, and it expanded that foothold rapidly after the divestiture. Fujitsu and NEC arrived from Japan, bringing the manufacturing cost advantages that Japanese electronics companies had been developing throughout the 1970s. The market that Western Electric had served exclusively for 100 years was, within 5 years of the divestiture, genuinely competitive. And Western Electric, now operating as AT&T Technologies, was not winning that competition. The company that had never needed to sell anything was trying to sell everything, in a market it had never had to understand, against competitors who had spent years preparing for exactly this moment. The communities that had organized themselves around Western Electric's facilities absorbed the consequences without the national attention they deserved. Cicero, Illinois, the suburb of Chicago that had grown up in the orbit of Hawthorne Works, lost its largest employer and never fully replaced it. The tax base that had sustained local services shrank. The retail businesses that had depended on factory wages contracted. The particular social fabric that forms around a stable industrial employer, the unions, the churches, the civic organizations, the informal networks of people who have worked together for decades, frayed and, in some cases, dissolved entirely. These losses were real and lasting, but they did not generate sustained national coverage because Western Electric had never been a famous company. Its workers were not the workers of a famous company. Their losses were local stories, not national ones. The Hawthorne Works site in Cicero sat largely vacant for years after the manufacturing operations ended. The buildings were too large and too specifically configured for industrial use to be easily repurposed. Some sections were demolished. Others were converted, eventually, to commercial and light industrial uses that employed a fraction of the workers the original facility had supported. There is no museum at the Hawthorne site. There is no significant public memorial to the 45,000 workers who passed through those gates at the operation's peak. The address exists. The history does not have a physical home. The Lucent Technologies chapter, the final institutional attempt to carry the Western Electric legacy forward, deserves to be understood as both a genuine effort and a cautionary illustration of how difficult it is to transform a company's fundamental character under time pressure. Lucent was created in 1996 with real assets. Bell Labs, which remained one of the most productive research organizations in the world, a substantial installed base of telecommunications equipment, and a workforce that included engineers and scientists of genuine distinction. The company's early years were promising. Its stock became one of the most widely held in the United States during the late 1990s technology boom, owned by millions of small investors who saw it as a stable, blue-chip technology holding. The collapse that followed was not inevitable, but it was not entirely surprising either. Lucent had inherited Western Electric's cost structures along with its assets. The high wages, the extensive benefits, the pension obligations accumulated across decades of employment. It had also inherited more subtly a cultural orientation toward large, established customers and long product cycles that was poorly suited to the fast-moving, startup-driven telecommunications equipment market of the late 1990s. When the dot-com bubble burst and the startup customers Lucent had been financing with vendor credit defaulted on their obligations, the company's balance sheet collapsed with a speed that shocked investors who had not understood how much of Lucent's recent growth had been built on credit extended to companies that did not survive. The merger with Alcatel in 2006 and the subsequent acquisition by Nokia in 2016 completed the transformation of what had been Western Electric into something entirely unrecognizable to its origins. Nokia is a Finnish company. Its headquarters are in Espoo, outside Helsinki. The Bell Labs name survives inside Nokia's research organization, a piece of American technological history maintained as a brand asset by a European corporation. The manufacturing legacy, the factories, the workers, the craft knowledge, the institutional pride, is gone without a physical trace in the places where it once existed. What does the Western Electric story teach, if it teaches anything? The lesson that business school case studies are likely to draw, the dangers of monopoly dependency, the importance of competitive readiness, the risks of a single customer revenue model, are real and worth understanding. But they are not the most important lesson. The most important lesson is about what gets destroyed when industrial infrastructure is dismantled and what does not come back. The knowledge that accumulated at Hawthorne Works across 3 generations of workers was not written down in any manual. It lived in the hands and the habits and the professional judgment of people who had spent careers learning how to make complex things reliably and at scale. When those workers were dispersed, when the factories closed and the workforce scattered, and the institutional community dissolved. That knowledge did not transfer to a spreadsheet or a successor company. It disappeared with the people who held it. Some of them found work elsewhere, some retired, some did not land well. But the specific combination of skill and experience and institutional memory that had allowed Western Electric to manufacture the communications infrastructure of a nation, that combination, once broken, was not reassembled. What do we lose when a company disappears and the knowledge it carried disappears with it? Not the patents, not the brand, but the human capacity to build things that work, built up over generations and gone in a decade. America has been trying to answer that question ever since. The answer has not been encouraging. There is a telephone sitting in a box in a basement somewhere in the American Midwest. It is black. It is heavy in the way that things built to last are always heavy. Not burdensome, but substantial, as if the weight itself is a form of honesty about what the object is and what it is meant to do. The dial is intact. The cord is coiled, still springy after decades of storage. If you picked it up and held it to your ear, the silence inside would be complete and specific. Not the silence of a broken thing, but the silence of a thing waiting. It was built to last longer than anyone who made it. It has. The people who made it are mostly gone now, retired or passed on, their working lives spent inside factories that no longer stand in the configurations they knew. The man who inspected the handset castings at Hawthorne in 1965, the woman who assembled cable harnesses in Baltimore in 1971, the foreman who walked the line in Kearney for 23 years and knew every machine by its sound. They built things that outlasted the institutions that employed them, and the institutions that employed them outlasted the arrangements that made them possible, and the arrangements that made them possible were dissolved by forces that had very little to do with whether the work was good. The work was good. That was never the question. Western Electric was not a company that asked to be remembered. It was a company that asked to be useful. And for more than a century, it was useful in ways that touched the daily life of every American without ever making itself visible. The telephone on the kitchen wall, the switchboard at the hospital, the cable under the street, the relay in the exchange that connected a soldier's voice from a base in Germany to his mother's living room in Ohio. None of it announced itself. None of it needed to. It simply worked, and working was enough. What Western Electric built was not just equipment. It was the physical precondition for a particular kind of American life. A life in which distance was not an obstacle to connection, in which a family separated by geography could close that gap with a 10-cent call, in which the texture of daily existence included the reliable, repeatable experience of a voice coming through a wire from somewhere else. That experience seems ordinary now. It was not ordinary when Western Electric was building the infrastructure that made it possible. It was, for the Americans who first experienced it, something close to miraculous. And the miracle was maintained day after day, decade after decade, by workers whose names appeared on no marquee and whose company appeared on no product. There is something in that anonymity that feels from this distance both admirable and tragic. Admirable because it reflected a genuine orientation towards service rather than recognition, a belief that the work mattered more than the credit. Tragic because it meant that when the work ended, there was no public story to tell about what had been lost. The companies that failed loudly, the airlines with their glamorous routes, the retailers with their beloved storefronts, the toy brands with their Christmas morning mythology, those companies left behind a grief that people could name and share. Western Electric left behind a silence, and silence is harder to mourn. The workers who built it deserve better than silence. The men and women who spent their careers at Hawthorne, at Kearney, at Baltimore, at Indianapolis, who raised families on those wages, who took pride in the quality standards they maintained, who understood that the objects leaving their hands would be picked up by strangers in every corner of the country and relied upon for decades. They were part of something that mattered, not because it was profitable, not because it was famous, because it worked, because it held, because it connected people to each other across distances that would otherwise have been unbridgeable. and it did so with a consistency and a durability that have not been matched by anything that replaced it. The Bell system is gone. The baby bells it created have merged and remerged into configurations that Enos Barton would not recognize and could not have imagined. AT&T exists as a name attached to a corporation whose primary business would be unrecognizable to the company that bore that name in 1964. Lucent is gone, absorbed into Nokia, which is a Finnish company building telecommunications infrastructure for a world of smartphones and fiber optic cables and wireless networks that have made the copper wire telephone as obsolete as the telegraph that preceded it. Bell Labs persists, diminished but alive, still producing research that occasionally changes the world, still carrying a name that means something to people who understand what it once represented. And somewhere in the design archives, if anyone has preserved them, are the original drawings for the Model 500 telephone. The proportions that Henry Dreyfuss calculated to fit the human hand, the weight distribution that made it feel right when you picked it up, the dimensions that produced that particular sound when the handset settled back into the cradle. Drawings made in the late 1940s for a product that would sit unchanged on American kitchen walls for 30 years, serving its purpose without complaint or failure, doing exactly what it was designed to do for exactly as long as it was needed. That is not a small thing. In an age that measures success in disruption cycles and version numbers and the speed of obsolescence, a telephone that worked perfectly for 30 years without requiring a single update is almost incomprehensible. It represents a standard of manufacturing craft that took generations to build and was dismantled in a decade, and that has not been rebuilt in the 40 years since. The Hawthorne Works is gone. The building that replaced it does not remember what stood there before. The streets of Cicero, Illinois, do not carry a marker for the 45,000 workers who passed through those gates at the height of the operation. The phones they made are in basements and attics and antique stores, heavy and black and silent, waiting for a network that no longer exists. But somewhere tonight, an American in their 50s or 60s will find one of those phones in a box, will pick it up, will feel the weight of it in their hand, and will remember without being able to entirely explain why that this object once meant something, that the ring of it meant someone needed to speak to someone else, and that the distance between them was about to disappear. That the world it came from was not simpler exactly, but was built on a different assumption. That things made well should last, that workers who built well should be honored, that the infrastructure holding a society together deserves to be seen and named and remembered. Western Electric was never seen. It was never named in the way it deserved, but it held. For over a century it held. And the telephone in that basement, heavy, black, indestructible, outlasting everything, is still holding now.